their quote marks. Now, actually, this week and last week, there has been an unfolding story that, to me, has made the quote marks thing entirely appropriate. And it's a very PPE kind of story, and there's, as you will know, I try to give lessons for life in each of these classes. So this is an important lesson for life for the quarter of you who end up in journalism. You know, a quarter in politics, a quarter in banking and finance, a quarter in law, and a quarter in journalism. So for the quarter of you who end up in journalism, some of you might escape into management consultancy, but that's one of those things. I mean, we try our best. I'm doing admissions at the moment. We try to select against this, but it just, anyway. So there's the BBC website from a few days ago, and if I blow up a little bit of that, you will see two headlines. Side by side on the website. And actually, for all that I had a go at them earlier this term, I think that's appropriate, really. I mean, that just about summed up the state of play. If you looked at those two things together, you'd think, yeah. And it actually got more entertaining, this particular story, because so I help teach a Sunday school class of kids on Sunday mornings at our local church, and it so happens, although I didn't know this for the first 4 years I was doing it, that 4 of the kids I teach in this particular Sunday school are the grandchildren of the bishop who baptised and confirmed me back in 1975. It's a sort of intergenerational revenge thing. I don't quite understand how that works. But anyway, so on Sunday morning we were, before the class, talking about current affairs. It's a slightly PPE orientated kind of Sunday school, as you'd expect from a PPE tutor. And I would say, well, there's a country in Africa that's been much in the news, and one of the 12-year-old girls said, oh yes, she said, that's Zimbabwe. And I said, does anyone know what's been going on? 10-year-old boy, Peter, says, great confidence, their president, hi Sammy, their president, he said, has been put under house arrest for being too old. So that's the message for the journalists. You may give a message and you may think your message is clear, but the audience may get the wrong end of the stick. The 85-year-old who helps us run Sunday school looked very nervous at the thought of being put under house arrest for being too old. Not quite. And anyway, there we are. So that was sympathetic.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Just one thing, so we can sync up the audio and video, just make like a loud banging noise on one of the tables.
By the audio device. Ready?
Thank you.
Excellent. Right. There we are. We are now synchronised. It's a kind of extraordinary way of synchronising things. So, I'm going to start, I think, with some natural deduction basics, I can call these things. And some of you are getting on very well and happily with natural deduction. You are becoming friends of natural deduction. Others of you, frankly, are not. So what I want to do, apart from use a flip chart marker on the whiteboard, which I think I've managed to avoid doing, well, I have so far, because I think we've anything on the whiteboard, is to point out to you the idea of the rules in the natural deduction thing, which is that if you have a formula, then, so this is formula 1, then underneath the line, and there'll be loads of other stuff going on up here, of course, as well, underneath this line, I'm only supposed to write something down that is licensed by whatever's above the line. So we want to know that whatever above the line, if what's above the line is true, then formula 2 will be true. So these are supposed to be kind of truth-preserving rules. Now, of course, they're not described as truth-preserving rules, they're just described as rules. They're just rules to apply in order to move from one formula to another. But we would like the rules to be semantically truth-preserving. Now, that sounds extremely abstract, so let's put some flesh on it. You can see this in action if you have P and Q, and you do an AND elimination and you write down Q. If that was true, that would have to be true. That's perfectly straightforward. So here we have the idea that formulae above the line determine the truth of what's below. And this is done with multiple formulae as well. So there are rules that say if you've got, for example, a P and a P arrow Q, then if these are both true, then that must be true. That's an arrow elimination rule, and it's very straightforward. Similarly, if you've got some argument that starts from P and ends up at Q by legitimate steps, truth-preserving steps, then we know that if P was true, Q would be true. And in fact, if P was an assumption, that would even license you, as long as all the steps are right, to discharge an assumption. So the rules need to preserve truth below the line. That's a fundamental idea. So then let's look at a way in which that might go wrong, and it's a way that has tempted some of you this week. So we imagine that we've got an EX formula, and we want only truth to appear below the line. Now, we might have some extremely simple entailment thing. So imagine that the one thing we are worried about is it might matter which variable you use. So we wonder whether EXFX entails EYFY. Now, you know, those are different formulae because they contain different variables, so it is a substantive question, although not a very exciting one. Does it matter which variable you use? Now, what's the answer to that? No, it doesn't matter which variable you use at all. So we want to try and prove that. We should be able to do so. So EX, FX. Now, here's something that's quite tempting, very tempting. EYFY. Now, this step, from here to here, is fine. If FA is true, then there must be something that has the property F. So that step, there's no problem with at all. That step preserves truth. If FA was true, that would be true. But that one's a problem. And I want to try to convince you once and for all that that is a problem. I think I have tried to convince you for 2 weeks now. This is week 3, but let me try and make it clear that this is so. So we have some formula EXFX. So we'll say some PMList rows. And to avoid any ambiguity, that is rows. One of my friends at Merton once had a letter from a former student, I may actually have said this to you in previous weeks, who was in Croatia, and the letter said that he was in Croatia doing that. And my friend said he's in Croatia rowing. I said, are you sure? They do other things in Croatia than row. They also row. There was a lot of rowing going on in Croatia at the time. Are you sure that he was not rowing? But he did actually turn out to be rowing. So we say some PMList rows. Now, random selection of PMLists, well, not that random. So there's one here, and there's another one living the life of Captain Pugwash out on the water, right? Okay. So I say, well, there's some PMList who rows. Now, I don't know which PMList, and it doesn't matter which PMList, so I'm going to write down that. Now, is that true? No. Right, okay. Said with some conviction. That's what I'm doing. Okay. So the admissions process did work there. That's kind of good. Okay, so now I say, well, if Johnny rows, then and then I could say some PMList rows again, but with a different variable if you like. What's gone wrong? Can I move from here to here confidently? No, I can't. I don't know that the thing that I randomly select will be the thing that has the property. This could be true, and this can be false. That's not intended as earth-shattering news, but it is intended to begin to motivate why the rules for E elimination work the way they do. So imagine that we say EX, FX. And I want to get rid of that and replace the x with a y. That's all I want to do. It's simple, it doesn't matter which variable you choose. So now I develop an argument, and the argument starts by inserting a name letter. So I take this formula and I remove the existential quantifier that has everything in its scope. You can only do this if the EX is at the start. And I write down this. Now notice here that the A is an assumption. The name letter is an assumption. It's the equivalent of my choosing Jolly as my random name of PMList. And that name might be wrong. It could be that it was something else that had the property F. Now, if A had F, then I can, at that point, introduce a new variable, because if FA was true, then EYFY would have to be true. You couldn't have FA true without something having F. Now, I've now generalised from my randomly chosen variable, and this, therefore, does lead to that. If EXFX is true, EYFY must be true. That allows me to write down EYFY and to discharge the A. Why couldn't we just go down the page? We can't go down the page because we can't trust the name letter we choose to be the name letter that actually has that property. So you've got to basically wipe that name letter out. You've got to wash it away somehow in the proof. So you end up with a formula here that does not include the name letter that you started with. And it's always going to mean that whatever formula you write there is going to be the thing that you repeat below the line. Now it's very important that you get this, so is anybody still concerned about that? Amy?
Could you try explaining it like with how you explained the other one?
Okay. So I say, okay, well there's some PMList who does rowing. I don't know which one it is, but it's one of the PMLists. So I'll choose a name at random, so I could choose Petra or Jolly. So I choose Jolly's name. So Jolly rows. Now that might be the wrong person I've selected, but for the purpose of this proof it won't matter, because I'm going to make this proof such that Jolly's name, only his name, is expunged from the answer I come to in the end. Now assume that I work my way through the proof to the point where there's no specific name mentioned here, then the thought is it won't then matter which name I chose at this point, because that name has been wiped out. And you can see that, I think, reasonably clearly here. So there's some x which has the property f. Which x might that be? Well, don't know. Let's say Jolly. For the purpose of the argument, we'll say him. So Jolly has f. Well, if Jolly has f, then it's possible for me to reintroduce an existential quantifier with a variable of my own choosing, namely y. Now, of course, I could have chosen Petra here, in which case that would be actually true. But it doesn't matter whether that specific instance is true or false for the purpose of this proof. Is that okay? Does that make
And then how do you get to the last line?
How do you do this?
Yeah.
So, The rule for existential quantifier elimination just says this. If you've got some E formula, then here, so imagine that x is our variable here. Then here you have some formula where x is replaced by a name letter, A will do. Of course, if there's an A already in this, you're going to have to choose something different, but you choose a different name letter. So this formula is exactly that formula, but with all of the x's, which were bound by the existential quantifier, replaced by a's. Now, at this point, you just do some proving stuff. And every premise of your argument, everything you've got, assumptions that you make, all of those are available to you here. But at some point here, this argument is going to resolve itself into some formula phi. That means that if you introduce a randomly chosen name letter in place of x here, and then you do an argument which lands with phi, then phi will be true on the basis of this, whatever name letter you choose. Therefore, phi must be true given all the stuff that happens above the line. That was the point of all that thing. Anyone else? The other place where you meet this sort of thing, and it, although, I mean, in some ways it's more complicated even though it's L1 because it requires two proofs, is the whole disjunction thing. So if you've got a disjunct, so phi or psi, then you can't proceed down here on the basis that phi is true, and you can't proceed below the line on the basis that psi is true, because phi or psi tells you one or the other is true, but we don't know which one. So we need some proof stuff here that enables us to say that whether phi was true or psi was true, some particular determinate thing would be true. So you have a proof, and it doesn't necessarily have phi at the very top of it, but that's normally the way we draw it. So you have a proof that starts with the left-hand disjunct, and a proof that starts with the right-hand disjunct, and both of these proofs end up independently, they're separate proofs, proving some formula, call it theta. So just like E elimination, you've got something here which is shown, in this case, whichever one of these was true, to yield the same thing. So if phi or psi is true, at least one of them is true. Whichever one of them is true, theta is true, therefore theta is true.
Phi and psi, they're just assumptions.
So phi and psi, what here?
Yeah.
So if, imagine you're given, well, let's do an actual example. So that's not a terribly spectacular, interesting or exciting argument, but it will do for the purpose of demonstrating what we need to demonstrate now. So it's an argument and it's got two premises. P or Q and R, P arrow Q, therefore Q. And you can see, I hope, just by looking at the argument, that if P is true, then that will make Q true. Whereas if Q and R were true, Q will have to be true anyway. So I hope you can see by inspection that that's a good argument. You could certainly do a partial truth table thing on it where you could say, well, imagine it was a semantic sequent and imagine Q was false. Well, if Q was false, then what would the truth value of that be? False. False. So what would P have to be? So if P was true, what will Q have to be?
False. Well, it need to be true, but it's not going to be.
Yeah, exactly. So we've hit a problem, and that's, remember, partial truth tables we've been doing since about week 2, I think. So you can do this if it was a semantic sequence by partial truth table, but it's a syntactic one. And what I said last week or the week before is still holding good. A syntactic sequence makes a claim about what is true in natural deduction. So we're going to see how we can make this work. So we start off with our, as it were, the master formula that's actually going to do most of the work for us here, and it's this. P, or, Q and R, and we're only allowed to write below the line what's true given what's above the line. And at the moment, we have nothing to write below the line because we don't know which of these disjuncts, both of them might be, which of the disjuncts is true. So we're going to have 2 proofs. One of them is going to have P, and one of them is going to have Q and R. Now, what we want at the end is to get Q there. That's the conclusion. So we want each of these separate proofs to finish with Q. Now, in fact, that one's already done, because Q and R yields Q straight away just by standard AND elimination. This one, however, well, how are we going to get from P to Q? Quite straightforward, because we've happily got this premise. So premises, Halbach introduces them as a kind of assumption. Think of them as free extra truths that you can put on your natural deduction thing. So if P and P arrow Q were both true, what would be true? Q would be true. So by arrow elimination or conditional elimination at this point, modus ponens, you can move from P and P arrow Q to Q. By AND elimination 1 left, you can move from Q and R to Q. So whether P or Q and R, whichever one of the disjuncts was true, Q would have to be true. So because of that, we can now discharge the P and the Q and R, because we didn't know which of those was true. So we assumed each of them for the sake of one argument each. And the result we've got to is just Q, which is what we want. Why go through this at such inordinate length? Answer, to make it clear that we only want to be truth-preserving below the line. That's what justifies E elimination having a subproof. That's what justifies OR elimination having 2 subproofs. We need those subproofs because otherwise we will be starting to write speculative things below the line, and we don't want to do that. Now, I'm going at this point to jump very quickly and without great ceremony to question 7.43, which was the one where, let me grab the question, 7.43 I think it was, yep. So we've already met a question which looked like this. So we've already met that thing. And those of you who've done this, and I did a sketch of it last week very briefly, and I will, when admissions have started to calm down, which ought to be fairly soon. I mean, I know 9th and 10th week are going to be crazy, but we've been selecting for admission over the last few days, and I've not got much sleep, actually. But we've met this. Obviously, P isn't contained in here. Therefore, this must be some kind of situation where we've got inconsistency here. This is inconsistent, and because it's inconsistent, it entails anything. Now, as I said, this is going to be very brief, and it's not talking about how you do the proof. It's talking about what restrictions there are on what can be proved using particular methods. So, I'm going to set a proof up that's just like what we've already met. You have an existentially quantified formula, and you're only allowed to write below here things that we have adequately shown would have to be true if this, and in this case only this, was true. Now, all of you recognised that if this is inconsistent, in principle it should be possible to prove anything. So what restrictions might there be on the anything? Well, what's the first move going to be at the top of this particular proof? What are we going to write down here? It's going to be this minus...
The existential.
Yeah.
So just a.
So it's going to be AY bracket RY... Sorry?
T.
T, okay. I don't think Volker would like that, but okay. Double arrow...
Volker uses.
Not... Is it?
Yeah, he does.
That is actually rather helpful because if you're doing it from a universal, it's very useful to have some kind of dummy letter that would never turn up anywhere else. Okay, so here we've got
I think the last two should be replaced because they're one.
they're wise. Okay, you're quite right. I was over enthusiastic with my T. So there we are. There's a formula. Now, and we are supposed to be able to prove any formula whatsoever in this place where phi comes, because this is inconsistent. Can you think of any restrictions now on what phi might be?
Can't have T in it.
It mustn't have T in it. You've got to discharge whatever letter comes here. Remember, that was why we had to be careful. So that very early this week in your exercises, the ones where something's gone horribly wrong with this natural reduction, what's gone wrong? And all of you recognised, I think, that what had gone wrong was a failure of the E elimination rule. And the failure was that you'd introduced an A, I think in each case, with the E elim at the top of the proof, and then that A was still there in the way when we kind of were supposedly E eliminating. So phi cannot contain T. That's a restriction on what phi can be. Does that matter? No, because...
I don't know. I did it from the way it's
because...
It's arbitrary thing.
Yes, so we could...
Just replace it with
But we could choose a different letter. We don't need T. So if you look at whatever phi is here, so imagine that phi was, say, ft arrow p, something like that. Well, that's a formula that contains T. So we know that we don't want T to be the thing we substitute here. Well, are there other things we could substitute? Yeah, there's any number. We could have A, B, S, T3. There's all sorts of other things. So the answer that was being fished for in that rather, I thought, over-egged question was simply there are restrictions that L2 logic imposes here that won't be in any OR elimination because of this business about letters. If you've got a letter in the formula you would like to prove by ex falso quod libet, or whatever's going to be going on here, if you've got a letter here, that letter mustn't be the letter you choose at the top. You've got to choose a different letter. That's just a restriction on the proof procedure. It's not a restriction on what you can prove. So having mentioned then 7.1, let's go back and just briefly make sure everybody is clear. So we've got EX, PX, and QX. So it's an E elimination, so if it goes properly, James has got a hand up.
Sorry, I can't ask quickly. If you can prove an inconsistency, like we did then,
Yeah.
are you allowed to have a contradiction follow from that? Like, could I?
Yeah, anything would follow from it.
So you could follow.
P and not P, or yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just wondered if maybe those were not, but.
There's no restriction then on what any formula follows from a contradiction. Or any sentence follows from a contradiction. Yeah, good. So we know that what's going to happen here is going to be something like that. So this is now an assumption, but it's an assumption in that what is assumed is a name letter in this formula. We're assuming that the thing that makes this true is A. It might not be, but we're going to wash the A away, so that's going to be fine. But then what the proof, the not actually a proof does on the page here is to write down PA, then write down PA here, then write down EXPX. So what's wrong with that? Well, just to repeat ourselves, PA and QA yielding PA, that bit is fine, that's truth preserving, no problem about that at all. But we can't E-eliminate at this point because this thing still contains the letter that we've introduced here. So we can't discharge the letter and we can't let the letter intrude on the proof below the line. We don't know that A is the object that this refers to. So there's something gone wrong. And what's gone wrong is that whilst this was fine, we had to then generalise out, we had to make that move there before we could then say, well, if this was true, this would have to be true, and that's perfectly respectable. That's a proper E-elimination. And at that point, you come back to here and say, well, it doesn't matter whether it was A or B or C or T or any other letter. Whatever letter it has been washed away, so we can remove the assumption that it was A and proceed, as it were, as if nothing happened. Now, the first one of those, 7.1, part 1, that was a part of it, and 7.1.1 was repairable because it was a perfectly respectable sequence, a perfectly respectable argument. The problem with the argument was that it was simply had these bad E-elimination moves. Number 2, have you got the questions there, Sammy? No. Won't take it in without. So number 2 has a bad E-elimination, but also it's in any event a bad sequent. In fact, it's a bad sequent we're going to meet later, right at the end of this set of exercises. So the bad sequent is all x, e, y, r, x, y entails e, y, all x are, so that's an x and that's a y, e, y, all x are x, y. Now this is hugely tempting. It's hugely tempting to think that that works, that that's okay. There are lots of ways in which we could show that this is wrong. But it's not so easy to show that this is wrong syntactically. So what's the claim? The claim that this makes is you can do a natural deduction proof which starts here and ends here. And you can't, because this is a bad sequent. Now, do we have any means of showing that a syntactic sequent is a bad syntactic sequent? Well, no, we don't really. Beyond the assurance that if this claim were false, then so would this one be. Which you will notice is staggeringly different from the first claim to the tune of one little horizontal bar. This one says you can prove this from this in natural deduction, which you can't. So it's a false claim. This one says if this was true, this would have to be true as well. Couldn't be false. So if we can show that it is possible for this to be false and this to be true, then as long as you feel happily assured that this and this map onto each other, a counterexample to this will serve as a proof that this is incorrect. You may notice that there are some huge promissory notes going on here. What we're saying is that if this is correct, then that will be valid. If this is incorrect, that will be invalid. If this is valid, that will be correct. If this is invalid, that will be incorrect. What are we relying on? Well, we're relying on the rules in natural deduction to be truth-preserving. We're relying on just the thing I was appealing to in your intuitions when I used the jolly as a rower kind of example. I was using meaning and truth to try to give you an idea of why the rules work the way they do. Now, I'm just going to assure you, as Volcker assures you in the book, that natural deduction does model semantic entailment, and semantic entailment, or failure of semantic entailment, does entail failure of natural deduction proof, because if you're assured of those things, then we can then proceed on the basis that you can produce a counterexample, a semantic counterexample to this, in order to show that this is incorrect. But there's a lot of logic, a lot of fairly deep logic sitting behind that. And you can't really directly produce a counterexample to this, because it's a syntactic proof and it only makes reference to natural deduction. So let's look at this thing, and then let's look at it in a number of different ways. So here we're going to be appealing partly to English and partly to logic. So imagine that we have R2 where something loves something, and our domain is people, or living people. Now, what would this formula say on that domain?
Everyone has someone they love.
Yeah, everyone loves someone. Yeah, good. Now, do you want to have a go at that one?
There is someone who is loved by everyone.
Yes, exactly. Everyone loves someone. Someone is loved by everyone. Do you think that the first entails the second? No. I mean, even if it were the case that there was someone who was loved by everyone, even those who hate President Trump actually love him because they kind of make a living out of comedy shows about him, or kind of loads of reasons to love Trump that aren't because you think he's doing a good job. So even if there were somebody who was loved by everyone, it would be possible for there not to be. Everyone loves someone does not entail there is someone who is loved by everyone. If each of us loved the person immediately to our right going around the room, it wouldn't follow that any one of us was loved by everyone in the room. So that's a model, a counter-model to this claim. The famous places where this turns up in philosophy usually are connected with various things like fallacies of composition. So if R x y was x causes y, sorry, is caused by y, isn't it? So and we're going to imagine that our domain here is events, allowing that events are the kinds of things that can be caused. So Rx, Y, X is caused. Every event is caused by some event. So each event that happens has some event that causes it. That's, you know, broadly speaking, until the very limits of physics, he said, looking at the physicists, what caused the Big Bang, you know, that kind of question. So it's a deep question in the limits of physics, but every event is caused by some event. Now, of course, if you allow that this is just simply a limit of thought, that we can't allow for that to be false, then you might possibly say, well, this is perfectly consistent with an event causing itself. And it is perfectly consistent with that. So if you allow that the Big Bang, for example, could be a self-causing first event, then you don't undermine the truth of that, and the Big Bang then is allowed to come within this. Fred Hoyle, famous Cambridge astronomer and a very blunt atheist Yorkshireman, was deeply opposed to Big Bang theory. He was one of the most prominent naysayers on Big Bang cosmology. And the underlying reason why he was against it was because he thought if you believed in Big Bang cosmology, you were opening a really quite seriously wide door to theism, to belief in God. Because there was no beginning, and the question of physical explanation hit a limit, and the question of explanation didn't hit a limit, so what were you going to say? So that's about event causation in sequence, and you might, if you buy this, and most of us do instinctively think every event has a cause, or every event, sorry, is caused by some event, what caused that, then you buy this, but then you have to either believe in infinite backwards causation, or you have to believe in self-causation at some point, which are pretty deep metaphysical thoughts. This one says, therefore, from here, therefore, there is some event, so there is some x, some y, which is the cause of, so every event is caused by this one y. There is something which causes everything. All events are caused by this one. Now, presumably, that on the basis of how this is done, note, although not often noted, including itself. So that does involve self-causation. Now, I said to one or two of you in notes I wrote, this gets theological pretty quickly. That might very well be an orthodox religious claim in many religious traditions. There is something which self-causes and causes everything. It might even possibly be true. But it doesn't follow from that. What does follow from this is that there must be some self-causing event, or that events are backwards infinitely in sequence without ever stopping. Aquinas' third way at the start of the Summa Theologiae says there aren't constructed infinities even backwards, and therefore that has to stop somewhere. And this all people, he says, call God. James.
Would it be provable if you could add a premise that said things can cause themselves?
So it still wouldn't be provable, because if you think of events in well, it shouldn't be provable, because if you think of events as sequentially ordered, so if A causes B, causes C, causes D, and so on, and A is allowed to cause itself, then A doesn't directly cause every event.
Yeah.
So a model for this has sequential causation through time in a way that actually many of us feel, even if you want to add some branching here, is quite plausible. This one introduces a really quite major claim of there being a cause of all of this. And that's the point where this could be true and this could be false.
Is there a way to standardize the argument that like makes it say that there is a cause of each thing? Because when I read like there is a cause of everything, I was thinking like, well, there's a cause of each thing.
Individual one by one.
One by one.
Yeah.
Not that.
Yeah. Now what?
Does it formalize the same as the premise? Is that the issue?
Yeah. So what Russell says goes wrong is that he doesn't particularly have a trouble with this, although he's not, I think, quite sure what to do with the self-causing kind of bit. Russell is an interesting kind of empiricist. His openness to mysticism is something that people often overlook, but the Little Mysticism and Logic book is an intriguing kind of insight into how an honest empiricist tried to deal with some of these questions. But this just says each thing, as you said, individually has a cause. This one, on the other hand, and so the fallacy of composition says, this, as it were, treats the aggregate of all individual events as a thing that could be caused. Now, of course, what it actually means, and we know this from our logic, is there is something which causes each thing. But certainly to get from here to here looks like you've had to think of the set of all things as a grand scale conjunction that has a unitary cause to it.
So you probably already explained this, but the premise
Yeah.
is that bit you've just drawn there. It's like A needs to be
Yeah.
C, and then the conclusion is like there's something else other than A that leads to each thing like directly.
Well,
What it was saying.
so what the conclusion says is,
So like could you draw that diagram like on a diagram? The conclusion?
I could try my best. So if we imagine that we're just thinking about this,
Yeah.
then the claim here is you've got. So our domain is events, and that is a kind of curly bracket, and then between the curly brackets, every event.
Yeah.
Now, I'm speaking as if that was easy. You need criteria for individuating things in order for them to count as objects that can be talked about. To be is to be the value of a variable, as Quine says. Your criteria for individuating an event, so each heartbeat of yours is also a whole conjunction of events of molecular biology. What's an event?
Yeah.
You get into set theoretic problems even in biology at that point. But I'm thinking that if we can do a job of individuating each event and having a set of all events, then this could be satisfied, this could be true, if, imagining that we've got some set, either it goes backwards to infinity, in which case we never find an event that isn't caused, but that becomes really a genuine assertion of the complete backward infinite time, which looks like it's going to cause worries for at least two of us who are going to be thinking about when the Big Bang happened and stuff like that. Because we certainly don't have any conception of time that stretches back beyond there, any framing. Or you say, oh, well, let's cuss this for a game of soldiers, let's allow there to be a first self-caused event. And then you can leap forward. Now, what this says is, imagine that you've got you've got this event space that is all the events within some grand kind of grab bag of events.
Yeah.
Now we're imagining that there is something which both encompasses that and is itself an event which causes itself. But ignore for the moment the self-causing thing. This says there is something which every event, including note itself, is caused by. And as I say, without wanting to kind of give you any solutions to this, that looks like it is getting into some pretty deep, if not theological, then at least metaphysical territory. Another fallacy that you might think is a fallacy of composition or something like this. So Aristotle says every person aims at some good. Therefore, he says, there is some good at which all people aim. Well, one might say, if we allow that subjectivity determines for each of us a different good, then it's absolutely unclear that there is some good that each of us aim at that is the same good, because the good for you might not be the good for me.
It's kind of like whether the good is a variable EY, or it's A.
Yes. I mean, I think Aristotle is committed to the notion that they're, almost pre-committed to the metaphysical notion that each of us aim at a good, whatever our consciousness tells us. Whether and we might say, actually, all of us are aware, if not in our own case, then in the case sometimes of our friends, of people who aim at things that they believe to be good that we don't think are. So if you think that all people aim at a good, but not in the conscious sense of having a good in mind, because that might be wrong, they might be aiming at something but it not be good, but their lives are in some way orientated towards a good, whether they like it or not, then it might be that something like Aristotle's story would be true. Most of us are so embedded within a sort of liberal individualist kind of culture, which is not to decry that, but to say he wasn't, that we are inclined to think of the good as something individual to each of us. In which case you might be suspicious of an argument that begins, all people aim at some good. You might think, well, so far that's okay. Therefore, there is some good at which all people aim. You might think, no, that's a fallacy of composition. That's a bit like this.
What's the difference between fallacy of composition about making the question?
So a fallacy of composition says... So the fallacy of composition here says, if this is true, then all it does is to set up a binary relation between event pairs.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
If you thought this was true, then this treats the whole group of events as if they were a kind of object to be caused. And that's the composition. It's the composition of each of the events into some grandiose, totalising thing that then you start looking for a cause for. And Russell's complaint was, this is what we are ordinarily convinced by when we think that ordinary causal reasoning, principle of sufficient reason, all that kind of stuff goes together. That's fine. But if you move from here to here, then you start finding all sorts of metaphysical nonsense like cosmological proofs of God's existence plausible, because you move from ordinary causal reasoning to this kind of composite causal reasoning. Now, nonsense proved cosmological proofs of God's existence, maybe yes, maybe no. I mean, so that's philosophy for you to come to later on if you want to. Notice that even Volcker, in his logic course, hasn't been able to keep metaphysics out, right? And that's a sign that logic, as I think the conversation we were having about logic kind of pushing you in all sorts of directions, well, it can do. And so these last weeks of the course are intended to open up horizons of logic kind of questions, but also logic as it relates to some pretty big philosophical questions kind of stuff. And whatever else I think of the Halbach course, that's a good thing. So,
Is there a possibility that we can move to a break soon-ish, given this battery's dying?
Right. What's the time?
It's about 2:45.
About 2:45. That's sounding like a good idea. We have a couple of minutes. Okay. There was, at the end of that 7.5 7.4 section. So the 7.4 section was introducing some of the set theoretic paradox stuff. And a lot of it was generated around the notion of what we could call self-membership, a set that's a member of itself or not. And many of you noticed that this was heading off in the direction of Russell's paradox, which you've heard of, and you can read a lot more about online or in various books. When Russell wrote that short letter to Frege that undermined a lot of what, or Frege took to have undermined a lot of what he was up to, a problem was set in motion about how you treat the notion of membership. Are sets allowed to be members of themselves? There had been a tendency to treat sets as a kind of, very egalitarian kind of thing, where you could have, on the one hand, a completely empty set, and on the other hand, a set that contained vast numbers of, say, empty sets. And these were just sets. Set was a description of an order of existent, and they were all of the same order of existent. And so the notion of self-membership, whether things could be members of themselves or not, generated a problem. The stitched together Russell answer to this problem was to set up a hierarchy of sets. So you would have, as it were, simple sets, and then sets that contained simple sets, and then sets that contained simple sets and one order up sets. And this was the origins of something that he called the theory of types. And the theory of types was a stitched together attempt to get round the paradox that he himself had noted in order to allow us to keep doing set theory. There are different approaches to the question of how you cope with some of these paradoxes, which, as long as sets are all things of the same order, you are going to get these paradoxes. And the theory of types, which Russell developed and then Frank Ramsey tried to sophisticate. So if you ever hear about the Ramsified theory of types, that's Frank Ramsey trying to come in and resolve some of the issues. But it was always a slightly ad hoc solution. And I'll maybe, for some of you, particularly for those of you going on to EDL, I might put a note round about how that conversation goes. That, however, is all I want to say on that, because it's much more important that we look at some more of the more basic exercises and translation things, but it's even more important that Alan gets some power back into that little machine. So we're going to have a 3 or 4 minute break now, and then just a short one to stretch your legs.
Close enough.
Right. 3, 4, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 12, 14. Petra and... Okay, so James...
Maybe. Is it going to go after to someone?
No, I don't remember. I'm getting ill, so.
Yes, come every day again.
Yeah, I know that kind of no. Yeah, true.
Right, maybe James is coming back now. This didn't occur anywhere on the homework at all, but I'm just going to briefly say a word about it. For each thing in the domain, if it has P, then it has Q. Therefore, there's something such that if it has P, it has Q. In Halbach logic, remember, we assume that the domain is not empty. If you assume that the domain is not empty, then making this claim is making a substantive claim, namely that everything, for each thing, if it has P, then it has Q. Notice that that doesn't make any claim about anything actually having P. This could be true if nothing has P at all. Because then for each thing you'll have false arrow something. And false arrow something is always true. And that's true of this as well. There's something such that if it has P, then it has Q. Well, that's consistent with it not having P. But in Halbach logic, for everything, if it has P, then it has Q, it follows that there must be something that if it has P, then it has Q, because we assume that there are things in the domain. Hodges, however, for those of you who've been reading that particularly luminary from time to time, he does allow an empty domain, and because there are no name letters here, the domain could be empty. If there are name letters, you can't have empty name letters. So name letters mean there must be something. But there are no name letters here. So he allows for the possibility that that is true in an empty domain. But any existentially quantified formula, there exists something such that is always false, because in an empty domain nothing exists. So Halbach would say that's a correct sequent, and his natural deduction should make that provable. Whereas for Hodges, there is one possible state of affairs that makes that an incorrect sequent, this true and this false, namely the empty domain. Now, before we get even on to that suspicious, I mean, that ought to look suspicious, right? So, but before we get on to that suspicious thing, following up on I think, Alan, a footnote to something that you were talking with me about in an email. So we've got a perfectly respectable sentence of logic, FA arrow P. If A has F, then P is true. So if Chris Woakes is fit, England will win the Ashes. That's one that is on most of our minds, I'm sure, at the moment. So if it looks at certain scepticism that it's on most of our minds. Okay, well, some of us think it's very, very important. Any of you listened to the women's T20 the other day? That was pretty spectacular. That's worth catching up on. I play, I tell you, that is worth catching up. So, so we say if Chris, so A is Chris Woakes, F1 is fit, P, England win the Ashes. This is just for the sake of writing that sentence at least once, okay? England win the Ashes. Just reflect on that thought. Now, if that's true, then we could say, okay, well, in that case, there's someone who, if he's fit, England will win the Ashes. So I want you now to think, and I've deliberately not put brackets on here, I want you to think about the consequences of doing EX in two different ways. So one is EX, FX, arrow P, with the whole lot inside brackets. The other is EX, FX, arrow P, with the EX outside the brackets. Which of those is to be preferred and why? They're both meant to say the same as the first one, except instead the first one mentions Chris Woakes, these just simply refer to someone. The first one. So this says what? Try and translate it back. What's the thing of the greatest scope in this first one? Arrow. Good. So this one we'll typically expect to read the if first. If someone is fit, then England will win the Ashes. This one, there's someone who, if he's fit, England will win the Ashes. Will, which one's to be
The
preferred?
second,
Second one, and why?
because it's a specific person. Like, there's probably someone who's going to be fit, but that doesn't mean that England will win the Ashes.
Yeah. I'm thinking, so this was perfectly respectable. What has the biggest scope here? In this one. So that actually has brackets around it. So if I want to add an existential quantifier to that claim, I have to put it outside the brackets. The point of this is the conversation we were having about how brackets might matter. Just to extend that thought, one version of this is EX, FX, arrow P. If you have that on a natural deduction proof, you're going to want to E-eliminate. And you're going to E-eliminate by having some formula like FA arrow P, and then you're going to generate some further formula from it. But it's definitely an existential quantifier type. I want you to think now with me about what, if we unpacked that by a process of logical equivalence, let's see what happens. EX, FX, arrow P. Now, the easiest way I think to see this is to regard the arrow as a not or. Not EX, FX, arrow P. Sorry, or P. Now that and that, those are equivalent. So here's another equivalence, and this is one we met a little while ago. All X, not FX, or P. So once you've gone through those steps, and this are equivalent, what quantifier? It's a universal quantifier governing a negation of F. Everything doesn't have F, or P is true. So everyone's not fit, or England win the Ashes. But that wasn't if Chris Wokes is fit, we'll win the Ashes. That's if everyone is unfit, then, or England, everyone is unfit, or England win the Ashes. And that's clearly not the original claim. So when I have been emphasising the significance of being careful about brackets, I'm especially concerned that you are careful about dropping brackets, and then when you need a quantifier to come in, it's so easy just to have FA arrow P, and then think, oh, well, that's easy enough. There we are, I've kind of introduced an existential. Just remember where the brackets are. It's perfectly respectable in how bracketing conventions to have this, but don't let it mislead you into ending up with a formula that you end up really having trouble with in terms of natural deduction or whatever. Now this says something, if it has P, then it has Q. Therefore, for everything, if it has P, then it has Q. That ought to strike you as a pretty fishy thought. It ought to strike you as kind of not sure about that. However, it's proved. Yes. And it's proved like this. So we start off with EY, EY arrow, QY. And obviously, because it's supposed to be a proof of this, we want it to finish all X, PX, arrow, QX. And because we want some proof from this that's going to result in that, here we're going to have EX, PX, arrow, QX. Any proof by E-elimination is going to look like that. It's going to finish looking like that. So that's what we would like. We're not going to be able to get there, but that's what we would like to get. So we now need to fill in what's going on from here. Now, all this is universally quantified. The universal quantifier has to come from somewhere. Universal quantifier introduction is a perfectly respectable rule that does indeed exist. So we'll probably have something like PA or QA above it, and we'll need to be sure that the A is acceptable for introducing a universal quantifier. That's going to turn out to be the problem. So what do we have from this? Well, let's say it's EX, PY arrow, QY, and the brackets are there. So we know that somewhere up here we're going to have a formula that's something like PA arrow QA, because that's the formula introduces our, remember, random name letter that doesn't have to be, that has to be discharged at this point. And look, oh good, well it looks like that might work. Has to be discharged because the A is just a randomly chosen letter. Now, we want an argument that generates, I mean, I know these are the same, but we clearly don't want to move directly from this to this to this, because that just looks a little bit suspicious. Just effectively introducing a random letter and then universalizing on it. We don't really believe that that's possible. So let's try it a different way. So this is an assumption, and the only assumption we've made is that A is the letter that makes that true, because we know this is true, so we know something like that is true. Now, another assumption, PA. Well, if PA was true and that was true, then QA would be true. And if PA yields QA, then that is true. Not true directly from here, claim, but true because PA is true. So you then universalize on this, and you get your result. Well, and then you bracket these quickly and hope that nobody notices. So you do this, and then you cross your fingers, and you hope the examiner doesn't see that you've made a really shocking mistake. Okay? It happens all the time. However, let's look a little bit more closely. So, this is true only if the thing that this licenses is the thing called A. I now assume that PA is true. Why did I choose A? Well, because it's there. So there's a sort of assumption of this, and then there's an assumption of the specific, very specific A that was this thing. If this was the thing that made that true, and if this was true, then that would be true. So these things are true only if a socking great load of stuff here is true. None of this, I mean, you could say at this point this is discharged by this move. But it's only discharged at the expense of this not yet being discharged. The A here is neither universal, nor is it licensed by anything universal. That A exists only as a result of this existential quantifier. So it's a specific A. And this is still a specific A at this point. It's not a universal A. It's not licensed by anything universal. So you can't universalize it. So this move doesn't work because we haven't discharged the A. We haven't made it anything other at that point than just a very specific letter that we chose to introduce as a name. Now, in fact, it's hardly surprising it doesn't work because the whole idea of this being valid is nonsense anyway. So we now want to show that it's nonsense, and remember, we do that by not any form of syntactic proof method, we don't have one of those, but by looking at the equivalent semantic sequent and showing that it's wrong. And we show it's wrong by producing some kind of a domain. And then by looking at the predicates and giving these predicates extensions which will make this work. Now, imagine that nothing had P. So that's always the first thought. Well, let's think, James, sorry.
Sorry, just to clarify. So is there nothing you can do in natural deduction that will always be able to prove an invalid argument is invalid?
No, natural deduction is a method of proving things valid. Your failure to complete a natural deduction proof doesn't itself prove anything.
But it's not like you can always prove a contradiction from a... Okay.
Natural deduction is set up as a stepwise proof method from one formula or set of formulae, or indeed from none if you can do it by assumptions only. So you can prove P or not P out of thin air by making appropriate assumptions and using the rules. But you can't disprove anything by natural deduction. That's kind of because, although we might be able to develop some means of seeing by examination on a natural deduction failure to prove in L1 that we could see what was going wrong, there's no way in L2 of completing a natural deduction proof. You could always keep bringing in a new letter.
Couldn't you, if you could prove the negation of the conclusion, wouldn't that prove that?
Now that, okay, that was, sorry Petra's not here yet because that was a thought she had. So imagine that we've got this set of formulae gamma and we're trying to prove phi. And imagine that in fact you can't, and the reason you can't is because it doesn't work. So now, this was a thought Petra certainly had, well in that case it must be possible to prove that. Well, let's have a look and see, just with some toy examples, whether that thought is a good thought. So, imagine I have a sequence Q and R entails P. Now, is that a good, is that entailment ever going to work? Is that a good sequence? I mean, could I get P from Q and R? No, hopefully not. If I can, there's something wrong with my logic system. So now, if that's a failure, then it ought to be possible on this thought to do Q and R entails hook P. But I don't reckon that's in any better state than the first one. So even in L1, the fact that I can't get P from Q and R doesn't follow that I can get hook P from Q and R. Being able to prove the contradictory of the conclusion from the set of premises isn't something that you can guarantee just because of the failure of the sequent.
If you could prove the negation of the conclusion, would that count as a proof that the argument was invalid?
No, for a reason I think you've already suggested. So imagine we had EX all Y, now remind me, RXY, if and only if, or was it if RYY, not RYY? Is that it? 7.4. Yeah, where is 7.4? Okay. EX or Y, RYX, arrow, not RYY. So it's the... Now that, actually, no, think about it. So that does entail anything, so that does work. Say P. It also, of course, entails hook P. Your question is if I can prove, so if I can prove that that entails hook P, it won't follow that this won't entail P as well. Now that's not the same as what you were suggesting, which was if I knew that a sequent was wrong and I could prove it's contradictory, will that add anything? But the problem there is I've already got to know that the sequent I'm going to produce the reverse of is wrong. And I've got to have some grounds for doing that. The grounds I have for doing that, it is actually the case, the grounds I have for doing that is this counterexample method of the semantic sequent. That's how I show that it's wrong. That's why the big prize in much of the second half of the 20th century in logic was developing model theory, developing the theory of structures. Because if you could show a structure that showed a sequence or a logical claim was false, then you would have a method of determining certain things that couldn't be true, which logic would love to have a really complete decision procedure. It would love to have a procedure that you give it a sequence, you give it an argument, and it could say, if it's valid, we can prove it. If it's invalid, we can prove that it's invalid. There are situations where, or there are certain logical procedures, which we don't have a complete decision procedure for showing that something's not valid. And this is the way we are going to show something's not valid here. P must have something in it. If there was nothing in P, then the premise would be true, but the conclusion would be true as well. We've got to have something in the extension of P, let's call it 1, that is not true of the extension of Q, because otherwise Q would be true when P was true. Now, but we've got to have something that has both P and Q in its extension then. So 1 must be in both P and Q, but then there must be something else that's in P but not in Q. So let's try and run this and let's see how it works. So, there's something such that if it has wings, then it has an orange bill. And that's true. Everything is such that if it has wings, then it has an orange bill. Actually, that's good as well, isn't it? Because the puffin, does it have wings? It does have wings. Inspect it. They're wings. So for each thing, so there's puffin and there's cow. The puffin has wings and it has an orange bill. The cow has wings, no. So it's true for the cow as well. So we need something else. For each thing, if it has feet, then it has an orange bill. That's true of the puffin. But everything, if it has feet, then it has an orange bill. So start with the puffin. So we say then X in our domain alpha. So first assignment is puffin. So run it with the puffin. For each X, and this particular X is the puffin, for the puffin, what's the value of Px? Does it have feet? Yeah, true. Does it have wings? Sorry, does it have an orange bill? Yep, so that's true. So for the puffin, this comes out true. So let's try a different assignment for X. So this is going to be, so if that was alpha 1, let's try alpha 2 assignment, and our alpha 2 assignment is going to be cow. So Px in our domain for alpha 2, the value of Px when X is cow, does it have feet? Yes, so it's true. Does it have orange bill? So that's false. So the value of Px arrow Qx in our domain with alpha 2 as the assignment is false. But this one was true. So we've got true arrow false, and that does the job. So that shows that you could have something which made Py arrow Qy true, but it wouldn't follow that everything would make Px arrow Qx true, and that was a model that we didn't even need the 3 there to show that. Note, footnote. when you set up a domain, the domain is all the objects you're allowed to talk about. You are not, therefore, allowed to assign as a meaning of a name letter in some structure 4, because 4 isn't in the domain.
Do we say the empty set's in the domain? If you don't define the domain as... So is the empty set in 1, 2, 3?
No, not yet. I mean, I could add it as another
No,
thing.
you could, but it's not in...
But it's not in the domain as such, because it's not specified as an element. There's no... So that's a good question. There's no, as it were, subliminal kind of adding of things. No. So don't, when you are assigning meaning to logical constants, pause while the techies work out what's happening with the camera. When you're assigning meaning to logical constants, the meaning of your logical constants must always be a thing that's in the domain. Further comments on what's allowed to count as a logical constant. So if you want to assign meaning to a name letter, that is not a meaning. That's a perfectly respectable meaning. If Darren is in the domain, Darren is allowed. He's not in the domain at the moment. Let's put him in the domain quickly. So if Darren's in the domain, we can give one of our constants the name Darren. We can't give a random bloke or a German city, or we can't, basically what is here has to be, think of the core thing that can appear here as a name, a proper name, and then we could riff off proper names for a little while if we want to, but proper names are the basic idea of what goes here. James?
If Darren were objectively a random bloke, would that be acceptable?
You can't objectively be a random bloke for this purpose.
Well,
So-
if the domain was like 1, would the constant be able to be 2 minus 1? Because that would be the same thing.
Well, no. You couldn't write 2 minus 1 because 2 minus 1 doesn't occur in your domain. Whatever occurs here has to have the assignation directly from the domain. Selena?
So if London is in the domain, we couldn't write capital of England.
That's right, yeah. You wouldn't write the capital of England here. And Halbach, in fact, I think quite late in the book, so I think the chapter we're doing for next week gives you some reasons why you might resist even using definite descriptions here. Okay, now that is a definite description. I don't know if it refers to anybody, and it might refer, for all I know, to Darren. But that at least has the advantage of referring to some specific person. It's the. So nothing that you write here should start with an indefinite description. The only exception to that is, imagine that your favourite local is called a hole in the wall. Now, that's not a hole in the wall, that's a pub that's got the name a hole in the wall. That's what occurs on the big sign outside. The pub's called a hole in the wall. I'm going to a hole in the wall means I'm going to a pub with that name. That's okay. So a hole in the wall names a pub. There are some pretty random pub names. You could imagine that being the name of a pub. But then that's not a genuine indefinite article. That whole block of stuff is a name. We are not allowed plurals here. mum?
Molly.
Molly.
Yeah.
I.E. or why?
Why?
Okay, I'm impressed. That's very good.
At the risk of offending people,
Yeah, it's
They
well,
don't-
that's a risk we run all the time.
they don't exist. So no, seriously,
Who's offended
Oh.
by that?
can we say that they're like objects?
Yes.
Well, they become objects for the purpose of a structure by being placed here. Now, let's go back to week 1. At the risk of offending people, we have menials to do this stuff, you know, that kind of thing. So, for the purpose of this class, and just not merely to please Tucker, I am going to be agnostic about the existence or otherwise of Ron Weasley's family. Now, that may offend you as well. Okay, so agnosticism is okay, but kind of being a true doubter, that's no good. Okay, so there is nothing whatsoever wrong with extensional definitions that went like this: domain characters in the Harry Potter novels. Okay, so that's fine. And I could... Obviously, there are going to be things you might worry about, like P, X, Y, X is taller than Y, where you might say, given that they are ideal and non-existent, then Harry, even if in the books he's taller than Hermione, might not be. But if I had PX, X appears in book 3, then that seems perfectly respectable.
So you can say something that doesn't exist has properties.
Well, they exist as
They
fictional
exist.
characters.
They exist as a book. I think the concept of them exists.
Right.
Isn't that fine?
Could you just say like X is canonically taller than Y?
No, because I don't think
Wouldn't that fix all the...
I don't think it's. It feels wrong, and maybe I'm overthinking it, to say that something that that you can't at least assume exists has any property. I think that we're assuming existence as a property for something that we can't assume existence of any other property for.
I think there are issues about fictional characters. There might be questions that we might ask about various forms of logical construction. I mean, does the empty set actually exist? Plato clearly thought that numbers existed, but they didn't exist in some kind of logical construction way. They really existed. In fact, they were more real than any of us are. They exist in the land of the forms, and that's where they really are, and that's kind of real numbers. Real not merely in the sense of the number line, but kind of real in the sense of absolutely, ontologically respectable to the very highest degree. For the moment, I'm going to recognise that there's a question that you've asked that's a legitimate question. I'm going to say that there are things like this one where something, Tucker, like your canonically move is going to, so if somebody says, how many children did Sam Gamgee have? Well, in order to find that out, you go and look. And you will probably, all of you, know that there is a famous literature of, it started, didn't it, with, was it Empson? How many children had Lady Macbeth? And the whole kind of question of whether there are genuinely, whether we think hinterlands to characters who turn up in novels. Well, of course, they don't really, as it were, have that hinterland. But then, by the time you've done early modern philosophy, assuming that maybe some of you might, you will wonder whether, for example, the chaplain sort of is just placed in a cupboard when she's not doing chaplaining. You don't see her then. Why should you imagine that there's any hinterland there? all this stuff about having parents in Kent, I mean, that might just be complete, baloney. It's just a front. It's just what she says. When you're not watching, she doesn't exist. So we really, when I said back in the first week, we have menials who do this truth and falsity stuff, that's kind of, we really don't know. But if you want to press that, then what's actually true and what's false might actually have very weird parameters. The fictional characters one looks like it's going to be obvious, but my worry is that if we don't allow fictional characters to be genuine values of a variable, if we don't allow to be the value of a variable to at least extend to fictional characters, then appearing in book 3 of the Harry Potter books looks like it's something you can't do. Because you can't be, and therefore you can't do things, and one of the things that Harry does is appear in book 3. Playing Quidditch, which is what for the first 4 or 5 books is about what he seems to do, really. But anyway, so good question. Talk among yourselves about it out of class. I cannot imagine Volker ever setting a question in an exam.
Does Volker set the logic portions?
He has done, so it will be probably Volker or Alex Passau from Wadham or James Studd from LMH. They would be the kind of obvious likely suspects for setting that, although we are talking about how logic exams get set at the moment, and there might be a different version in a year or two's time. But I suspect as Volker is lecturing this year, it might possibly be Volker. But the 3 people who would be most likely to do it would be those 3. Okay, we need to press on. So 7.2 and 7.3 are what we need to do. So 7.2. Formalise the following sentences. Sorry, before we formalise the following sentences, 1 or 2 of you asked things in your notes about doing some stuff on structures. I just very quickly did a structure thing there with puffins and things to try to make it a little bit more amenable. Did you get a sense of what was going on? And if any of you want more work on structures, we can do that later, but we can't do it certainly in this class, I think. So what you've got to do is to provide a dictionary and a translation for some sentences. And as possibly James and I were saying when we were coming over, this looks like revision. This is just going back and doing stuff. So not every book author is famous, which in English means some book author is not famous, probably. The not every book author thing is a little bit kind of an unusual construction, but we might have some book author is not famous. And you are asked here to provide formalisations that are as detailed as possible. And some of you got little squiggles in your marking because although what you produced was perfectly correct, it wasn't as detailed as possible. So we could have P1 is famous. We could have Q1 is a book. R2, someone wrote something. And then the notion of being a book author will be the notion of there being a book that someone wrote. So, or is author of, maybe, which preserves the notion of being an author. And then this is going to be, there exists some X such that and there exists some Y such that Q is a, so Y is book and X is the author of Y, and X is not famous. Now, there are plenty of versions of that you could have that start with a negated universal, not all. If I unpack this by logical equivalencies, I will end up with that negation coming right at the beginning and then followed by universals. But that's a nice linear one using ands. You will usually find that something that asserts the existence of something, and I'm taking it that although this starts non-literally, it's saying there is at least one non-famous book author. So this is saying there exists someone who has these properties of being a book author and not being famous. And that just links with ands.
Was there a causation thing that you can't swap around universal and existential quantifiers without there being problems? But can you, if you were to say EYEX, are there any serious problems with doing that?
In this particular case, none at all.
Are there cases where it matters which order you put to
Yes.
the same type of?
Yes. Because they will... There are ways of doing it that would look like they were less or more eccentric ways of paraphrasing the English, but the truth conditions for them may actually turn out not to be any different, so they will be logically equivalent. So let's just test your intuitions there. F, again, is a two-place predicate. Loves, there's someone who loves someone. Now, how would you read that?
There's someone who's loved by someone.
Yeah, so that does passive voice. Now, you could say that whether we use the passive voice or the active voice in English is a matter of stylistic concern. Logically speaking, they will usually be the same thing. The one that really does, and James, this isn't what you mentioned, so you weren't even suggesting this, the one that does make a difference is if we had something like that, and then we had something such as all x, ey, fx, y. If you then do ey, all x, fx, y, then that's exactly the kind of case that we were looking at with the causation one earlier on. Everything bears a relation to something. It certainly doesn't follow that something has a relation born to it by everything. So those are very definitely not logical equivalents, but I think if you unpack that, you will end up with something that would be equivalent. But it would be, as I say, there's a natural way of reading these in English that is different, and that might be a stylistic reason, but just a stylistic reason to prefer one to the other. Did anybody have significantly different things where I put anything in their work that suggested it might be worth having a look at any of those?
For any of them.
Yeah. Oh, well, for this particular one.
Oh, right.
Okay. Let's move on then. Okay, the next one was some books are famous. And the worry here was the plural, which possibly, James, your one was trying to do plurals. I know one or two people were trying to do plurals here. We will find it much easier to do plurals next week. Once we've got the equals sign, which is what next week's going to be, we're going to move on to L equals next. So here, some books are famous. We just have to realistically do this as at least one book is famous. There exists some X such that book X and famous X. And there's nothing much more we can do. When we have the equals, we can then say EX, EY, PX and QX and PY and QY, and this was, James, where you were using two-place predicate, but we're going to have this, and it's not the case that X equals Y. So next week we'll be able to add that. So this says there exists an X which is a famous book, and there exists a Y which is a famous book, and Y and X are not the same book. And that allows you then, I mean, I think there are silly exercises which require you to generate really significant numbers of objects, but you could add and PZ and QZ and X isn't Y and Y isn't Z and X isn't Z, and that allows you to get 3, and you can see how this is going to develop. A book is famous if and only if it's well written. Okay, guys, there were a lot of versions of this, and we need some of them on the board now. So, it doesn't matter whether you were right or wrong, because some of you were instructively wrong. Let's have some versions of this one. James.
So for all x, 2 open brackets, px and qx.
Yeah.
Close. If and only if px and rx.
So who got that? A number of you got something like that. Frankie did, Avanti did. Okay, any others?
For OS, open bracket, PX, arrow, bracket, QX, double arrow, RX.
Anything else?
I had the same thing as the first one, but without the PX and just. Okay.
So you had
The second bracket.
all x, px, so px and qx, double arrow, rx.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Right, so let's look at that last one first. And I take it that this is a book and this is famous, and R is well written. So let's look at this last one. Now, are we given a domain of quantification, or do we have to invent one? A dictionary. So, well, let's say given the amount of work we've got the predicates doing, we'll have a universal domain. Could be anything. Okay. Now, this one says for anything, if it's a book and it's famous, then it's well written. And for anything, if it's well written, then it's a famous book. Tucker, you just put your thumb down. What's the problem there?
Yeah, because I didn't go backwards.
Yeah. So imagine that we had an exceptionally well-written shopping list. Think of anything that could be exceptionally well-written. So a newspaper article, or a shopping list, or a play script, or a blog. Now, none of those are books, but they can be exceptionally well-written. So the problem here is that it's not true of anything, that if it's exceptionally well-written, then it's a famous book. What we